Dr. Dinesh Nilkan for inviting me, giving me this opportunity to speak here. I was first approached by Professor Xavier. I see he's somewhere else today. And then, of course, Professor Avijit has been very kind to me and chatting and taking care of all the logistics. So I'm looking forward to interacting with all of you today. And I have a selfish motive. I've requested you to please record it, and I want to put it on my website at Eagle Foundation, and I'm going to send it to everybody in the world. The reason is, and why I accepted this invitation is, I think this is the time that we need to tell the world that we, in our cautious approach, were right, and they, in their exuberance, were wrong. So let me start my presentation, and I must thank you for the hospitality and the good words that you have spoken about me. I'll tell you, I feel very humble. It's the nation which gave me all this. I must also share with you that all my education from, I am the old guy, so we didn't have 12th, we had 11th, but right from the best of best education that I've had, visits to Harvard, long-term postdoctorates at Harvard, Stanford, Sydney, all on public exchequer. So therefore I don't claim anything. I said the nation gave me all the scholarships. It's my responsibility and duty now to give back to the nation in the next 15 years of my life, that odd I have. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, I'm going to set a base where I'm going to show you how the world is moving. I'm happy to take question answers at the end. But before that, before I close, I want to also make my observations. So let's start working now. And this is how I'm going to base my talk. This talk is designed for about 40 odd minutes. And that's what the time given to me. I'm going to talk about the global slowdown, and that's growth. Then I'm going to speak about inflation and economic growth. Then I'm going to speak about the macroeconomic context. I'm going to show you India. I'm going to show you the rest of the world. And then I'm going to show you at the end the comparative picture. So this is the GDP growth, advanced countries. And this is the latest that I could lay my hands on, that is June data. Today, they're going to release more data. And today's data will be far worse than this data that you see on the screen. But this is the June data, and I must tell you that IMF, with all the 900 economists that they have under the roof, and about 900 odd economists sitting in the World Bank, these are the best estimates that they could give us, and this is the World Economic Outlook database that I have used. As you can see, the predictions are till 2027, but important thing to see here is 2020. You see everybody went into a difficult time and it was bad. And then you see in 2021 we started recovering, and 2022 is where we are right now in deep trouble. And then you see we are all going to face a very big meltdown. Now, why I've taken these advanced countries is, USA, single country, and there are 206 countries on the planet. The single country accounts for 20% of world GDP. Then if you take Europe together, they account for 23%, that comes under Euro, about 23% under GDP, and UK is again around 2 to 3%. Now there's nothing to be mesmerized about this, that the Americans are so strong, they're 20% of the world GDP, and that Europeans account for 23% of world GDP. There's nothing to get mesmerized. We have been the best in the world, and the highest income in the world for 3,000 years. These guys have only enjoyed it for 50 years, 60 years. So I don't think we need to get mesmerized by all that. For 3,000 years, we were accounting for 33% of the world GDP. And for nearly 2,000 years of that 3,000, we were accounting for more than 25% of world GDP. America today only accounts for about 20%. Europe in total accounts for 23%. So we have seen it, we have been there, we have heard it, we have enjoyed it. So don't get mesmerized. But just see the trend here, that we are looking at their growth patterns, and they're all going to slow down. And they're going to slow down from there. If you take 2018, which is not a bad year before the pandemic, 2018, 2008 is far behind when the Lehman Brothers happened. You look at 2018, which is a stable year, and now compare the year's performance against 2018, you can see that most of them are not going to make it to even 2018 level by 2017. So there's a lost decade for these countries. They should know this. This is the BRICS countries. BRIC countries are like us. Obviously, you can say, sir, why are you comparing it with America? We are so small. We might have been the richest in the world thousands of years ago, but today we are not. We have already been bled, looted, and all that plundered by the British. Now we are not what we were, right? So compare us with our comparative cohort, and that's why you see here, this is our comparative cohort, emerging countries, a term coined by the Goldman Sachs, BRICS. And we have Russia, Brazil, China, India, South Africa, and you can see that India is the brightest light here. Brightest light. We will be the engine of growth for the next, and I can tell you, I'm only showing you till 2027, that's the IMF estimates, but I've just finished a project for Niti Yoga and the Prime Minister talking about India 100, and I can tell you, we are the only country in the world, because of the demographic dividend that we enjoy, and because of the entrepreneurship that we Indians naturally enjoy, and our DNA being so strong and so much full of ethics and integrity. We may have in fighting between our country, we say this guy is bad, that guy is looted, that guy has done income tax evasion. That's all nonsense. Go and look at the sharks outside. You will realize we are far more honest, holier, and far better. Whatever said and done, the country today, our country today, is the brightest star on the sky, and it will continue to gain strength to strength for the next 25 odd years. The brightest future that one can imagine, we are in. Here is the growth story of the BRICS countries, and you can see clearly that India is amongst the brightest, and no other country is going to come closer to us. China, for that matter, people talk a lot about China, but please remember, they have experimented, fumbled, and faltered at many places. They had the one-child policy, then they realized it's a blunder. Now they have a three-child policy. Plus, the system is very different, not democratic at all, and we all know about it. And there are pitfalls that they have had, and they are going to have ahead in further times. So India turns out to be a far more stable, steadier, and far more sustainable economy. When it comes to the inflation story, this is something which I must share with you. The world, as an economist profession, we had tried various things as far as anchoring inflation is concerned. We believed in the Cambridge equation, which is the quantity equation, which says that MV is equal to PY, the money supply with velocity, prices and total output produced in the country. And then we experimented with the money supply hypothesis, and we said, no, there's a breakage taking place between the money supply and prices. So by about 1980s, we decided that the money supply story will not work. So we all adopted inflation targeting, not India, not America, but it all started from New Zealand on a casual radio talk just before the elections, and that became a buzzword. Very soon, by 1990, almost 50% of the countries accountable for the world GDP had adopted inflation targeting. So what is inflation targeting? It is basically a conceptual thought where you quantify the target of inflation days to come. Extremely challenging, very difficult. One monsoon failure, one drought, one flood, and it is over. And with the climate conditions that we are facing in right now, the global warming taking place, targeting inflation is almost impossible. But then most of the countries did take it. New Zealand, small country, started it. Australia adopted it. UK adopted it. America hasn't so far. We Indians haven't done it that strongly, though we have an inflation target from 2016. We went into it around 2013. Russia, of course, also has it. Other countries have it, but we haven't done it so strongly. But after the Lehman Brothers in 2008, many countries who were already on an inflation target from 1988 started compromising and ignoring it. And they said it's difficult because if you only target inflation, sort of you put on a blinker on your eyes, and then it's like a horse with a blinker can only see in front. You have sort of stopped looking at other things. And India said, well, we totally agree. And we are the pioneers of the multiple indicator approach. This was started by Bimal Jalan, the governor of the RBI, and this started immediately after the Asian crisis. He said while the rest of the world is looking at inflation, inflation is not the only thing. You have to look at non-performing assets, at the exchange rates, at the current account deficit. You have to look at within the country the interest rates, where they're going, the growth pattern. So he came out with a multiple indicator approach, and which I think until today there's no better approach than multiple indicator approach. In any case, the world moved on to inflation targeting, and since 1988 everybody thought we have conquered inflation. Now the story of inflation is very interesting. If you have time, read Paul Volcker. Paul Volcker became the Fed chairman in 1979, and he tried to conquer inflation by raising the interest rate sky high. He succeeded, but then America went into a recession. Now the issue is, if you're going to succeed in controlling inflation by plunging your country into a recession, they can afford it. But can a country like India afford it? Recession means there'll be high unemployment, and there's going to be other difficulties and sacrifices which the nation citizens have to make. Can we afford it? We can't. They can. And that's exactly what they're doing now, and I'll show you in the talk further on. So here are recent developments, as you know, and this is very amazing. You have been reading in the newspapers, people contributing, saying India is having very high inflation. Okay, so what's the inflation in India? 7%, 8%, that's the CPI, that's what you monitor. And then you say, no, wholesale prices, we do not monitor wholesale prices, we do not do policy actions on wholesale prices, but wholesale prices are around 10%, that's okay, fine. But look at the tolerance level, and I'll show you the data. Look at the tolerance level of inflation in our country. We are around 6 to 7%. Our inflation targeting band, which was imposed on us at one point of time and I don't mind sharing it, because we had the governor who was the chief economist at the IMF, and he said that inflation targeting is the way forward. We want to anchor expectations, partly right, partly wrong. And I had been telling right from beginning, you should read his pieces and my pieces, where I have been arguing you cannot have a 4% inflation target in India. Well, if you do that, it is very, very low. That's okay for advanced countries. But in a young demographic India, we cannot have it. Take a very simple example. At my age, one shirt, one trouser, and that can last me one full year, but not at the age of the children. They need one every 6 months. As it is in India, we have a festival called Diwali. On Diwali, you have to wear new clothes, right? So in a country like ours, where a young demographic population is there, you will obviously purchasing many, many more things during the year, unlike Japanese, where everybody is old, and one shirt and one trouser can serve them 10 years, not in our country. So you cannot have such a low inflation target. But it was imposed, so the inflation target was 4 plus minus 2, that means upper band is 6. Our inflation at CPI is around 7%. Now look at the rest of the world, and I'll show you the data in the next few slides. Rest of the world, they're used to inflation of 1% or 2%. And inflation over there has gone to 10%. Now suppose, bringing that same story into India, if our inflation had gone from our tolerance level of 6% to 24% or 30%, we would be worried. That's how they are worried, because their inflation has gone 4 to 5 times more their tolerance level. So that is something which has happened in the recent past. And why has it happened? So everybody will tell you it's the Russia-Ukraine war, but sorry sir, Russia-Ukraine war, I understand. Now, how much does Russia account for the world output? 2% or less. And how much does Ukraine account for the world output? 0.3% maximum, right? And of the world population, hardly. The world output, hardly. Yes, they have a role in fertilizers, they have a role in oil, they have a role in coal. But what are you telling me? That the large world that we are, the large countries that we are talking of, they have come to this situation? It's total mismanagement, and I'll show you how. So yes, not a bad idea of saying this is the trigger, and that's why we are suffering from such high inflation. But are you telling me inflation is such a temporary phenomenon? And if it is a temporary phenomena, do you need to do such hard-hitting policy initiatives which impact the whole world rather than your own country only? So those things have to be thought through, and I think they haven't. And that's why I think we need in our country at least talk to them and tell them that, look, you are on the wrong path. they listen or they don't listen, but then history will be able to judge that at least some country was showing them the right path. So, what all causes inflation? Many factors will cause inflation. And some of the factors that are being now told and they're genuine are supply chain disruptions. Yes, we saw it in COVID. There were supply chain disruptions, no doubt. But then, sir, why did the supply chain disruptions take place? Who gave all the monopoly to China and why? Do you know in 1978, there was not a single foreign company operating in China because that's a closed economy. And by 2018, there were 9,60,000 foreign companies operating in China, including the best companies, that names that you can think of, be it computers, be it shirts, be it shoes, be it anything. 9,60,000 companies operating in China and foreign companies, and these companies are obviously, we all study about monopoly, how good monopoly is not, how bad monopoly is, one has to avoid it. There should be no center of power in one single place. We all know, don't put your eggs in the same basket, and the whole world was quiet. And China was manipulating its exchange rate and cornering the global market. At that time, nobody said a word. And few people who did say, they were silent, saying that the Americans need all spectrum of goods. They need cheap goods and they need expensive goods, they need high-tech goods and they need goods which last only 6 months. So you created the monopoly power in China. Was it all economics? Or was there geopolitics? Or do you wanted to counter some country by empowering another country? Those things have to be thought through. And they were not. So then the supply chain disruptions happened. And then COVID told us that monopoly and single basket for all goods is something one need to worry about. The commodity price shocks, of course, are being ascribed to Russia and Ukraine, and partly true, but not completely true. But the biggest elephant in the room is the foreign countries, advanced countries themselves, including America. How did they go about an ultra expensive monetary and fiscal policy? Has anybody even looked at that and questioned it? And said, you teach in the classrooms the quantitative equation, you say MV is equal to PY, and you increase the money supply like there's no tomorrow, and now when it's come home to roost, you are blaming it on Russia and Ukraine, just on them? What is this going on? And when COVID happened, and everybody said, look, Indians are extremely miserly, their prime minister doesn't want to spend, their finance minister doesn't understand economics. And today you see the guys who gave such fiscal liberal packages saying, so much percentage of my GDP I'm helping my people, and India is just giving a piddly little. Well, there were economists who were saying, look, you have to save the gunpowder. Because this, if it is the same Spanish flu type thing, it'll come in 5 waves, it'll last 3 years. The first wave is okay, the second will be the most lethal, the third will be okay, fourth peter down, fifth normal. It takes 2.5 years for the 5 waves to get out of the system. And you have to keep your gunpowder dry. We are a poor economy, poor country. People don't have resilience. The governments do not have so much funds. And whatever action you take, if the Americans did it, they're burning their own selves now. So the Indians had to be cautious about it. Then, of course, because we're recovering from COVID, there's a pent-up demand of the past. That makes sense. So there's demand pressure up there. And then over this 2.5 years, consumer preferences have certainly changed. Things that you were consuming in 2019 before the COVID are not the things that you're consuming now. So there's a shift in the production and the demand, and therefore it has to reflect in the production. And in that transition, there's going to be inflation. So here is the inflation data of advanced economies from 2018, a year which was normal. Then happens COVID. Then happens, of course, the Russia-Ukraine war. And you can see most of these countries in 2018, which I consider is the best year as a base year, as a normal year which I can depend on, most of the countries here, advanced countries, are used to inflation of about 2%. Anything above 2% is a matter of deep concern for them. Here are the BRIC countries. And in the BRIC countries, inflation, as you can see, normally is generally higher than the advanced countries. This is an obvious indication, and I'm showing you only from 2018, but further on I'll show you for the last 50 or 70 years. But in the recent past, if you look, This is the BRIC countries, and the inflation here is higher. That should reflect in the inflation target too. The inflation targets for these emerging countries should not be same or closer to the inflation target of advanced economies. That's the logic, common principle that I have been arguing. Now this is a map, this is a chart which I want all of you to see very carefully. And what do you see in this chart? The Lehman Brothers happens. And when the Lehman Brothers happens, look at the way the balance sheets have expanded in these countries. They just went through the sky. In those 4 years, the balance sheet, and this is plain, pure quantitative equation. If you increase your balance sheet 4 times within 4 years, you are obviously inviting for inflation. And then happened COVID, and look, they doubled their balance sheet again. Now, this is how you manage this is not monetary management. You do not need a Columbia or a Princeton degree to do this. I could have done it better if all it demanded was expanding the balance sheet. And now when you expanded the balance sheet, there were people at that point of time, and you came out with all sophisticated jargon at that time. But my question is, before 2008, before Lehman Brothers, were you all sleeping when the subprime was being done? And you knew people do not have the wherewithal and the paying capacity, and you were bringing in all types of sophisticated derivative products, and those derivative products nobody understood. You call them with all great names, asset-backed securities and mortgage-backed securities. And then the Lehman Brothers happened, and when India at that point of time was exercising caution to a great extent, you think in India there was no pressure on housing? I was at that time in the RBI. I remember the governor himself saying, and if you remember, some of you are old enough in the audience, remember in 2006, 2007, 2008, housing prices were doubling in our country in 1 year. Was that a bubble? The governor at that time, Dr. Y.V. Reddy, called me and said, Charan, I'm worried. How? And I was the director of research of banking. Will it impact banking? And how can the prices double in a year in a house? When your money in the bank only doubles in 10 years or 8 years, your stock market gives you a return where your money doubles in 8 to 10 years, how can housing double in 1 year? We did a study across the country within 3 weeks, and we came to the conclusion there is not a bubble here. What has happened is, in 1991 the reform started, young men and boys and girls got jobs. Now is the time they're ready for marriage. And now because they're ready for marriage, the demand is genuine. And that 22 million houses shortage, which Professor Kundu of JNU had estimated, is genuine. So there is no bubble. We need to supply more houses. But a scientific study was done. And then we took policy measures. If you look at the LTV ratios, we raised the LTV ratios. We made housing little more expensive. And we said we need to keep cautious and mark the loans who are taking what is their capacity. But we did not introduce neither asset-backed securities nor market-backed securities. We did not adopt the derivatives. But rest of the world treated us as if we are illiterate. And you should read sometimes the Financial Times London saying the governor of the RBI does not understand what derivatives are. And after Lehman Brothers happened, Nobel laureates like Stiglitz said, if Dr. Reddy was the Fed chairman, we would not have to see the Lehman Brothers. So we have that. We have that capacity. We have that intelligence. But they don't want to listen. And because they don't want to listen, that's okay. But today that's not okay. And I'll tell you the reason why. So look here how the balance sheet of US increased. But do you think these countries bother? Because one does it, the other follows. And look at the European Central Bank. Their balance sheets also expanded. And look at Bank of England. Their balance sheet also expanded. So what happened? These advanced countries, which account for 50% of world GDP, are expanding their balance sheet. And what does expanding a balance sheet mean? printing money. And what does printing money mean? The quantity equation. If you are going to print money, your output is not increasing, prices are bound to increase. Why are you crying now? It should have happened much earlier. Because the world swung from crisis to crisis to crisis, it didn't precipitate. It precipitated now. And now, who has to bear the cost? We have to bear the cost. When you increased your balance sheet, you are pumping money into a country like India which didn't need it. Take an illustration. When I'm 5 years, you can't make me eat 5 parothas. And when I was 25 years, I needed the 5 parothas. You are now raising your money and taking away back the money. You're playing with me. Why? That's the point I'm making. You were reckless then. You are reckless now. You are globally irresponsible then. You are globally irresponsible now. And who's bearing the brunt? Countries like India, who were kind, who were serious, who were cautious during both the periods. So what are the implications of such inflationary dynamics that you do? Whenever your balance sheet increases, inflation increases, and obviously when the inflation increases, you are going to raise the rate of interest, and when you are going to raise the rate of interest, obviously growth is going to suffer. So in economics, we have a concept called a sacrifice ratio, which is taught at every class. And you can see in the sacrifice ratio, all of us will suffer. So this is exactly what happened. There is a global crisis, there is COVID, there is a slump. And now look at these estimates. This shows the blue line and the red line. And you see that earlier we thought this is how our growth will be. But every 6 months we find, sorry, mistake has taken place, we will be far more slower. And the data which is going to be released today, you will see this graph will further take a dip. The other way of looking at it is inflation in most of the countries will be brought down, as the prediction is in 2023. But in all these countries where inflation will be brought down, there will be a sacrifice ratio and it will reflect on growth. So this is how the growth in 22 and 23 is. So we are all going to be badly impacted by slowdown. And this data is still before today. Today's data will be worse than the data that I'm showing you on the screen. So now let's take a historical. I've given you the picture in the last 10 years from 2018. Now let me take you on a picture which is far behind, 1961 onwards. So here are the advanced countries, and you can see in the advanced countries how inflation has been behaving. I gave you the story of 1979, Paul Walker, US Fed chairman, and then he brings down and tames inflation, and he's treated like a hero, as if he has tamed a live tiger. And then everybody says the way to tame inflation is to raise the interest rates, but there will be a sacrifice ratio. And I say, fine, you can afford the sacrifice ratio. Can a country like India afford? Because your actions are going to impact my exports. And these days, when we were young and in college like you, as students, we used to understand that the world is interrelated through trade. But now we know the world is not only interrelated through it goes below it, he'll give you a high salt diet. See, your heartbeat has to improve. Similar is the story with your body temperature. You have a certain body temperature, you're used to it. Everybody's body temperature may not be the same, but there's a band of tolerance body temperature. If your body temperature is below it, you are going to feel very uneasy, and you'll not feel the best of yourself. And if the body temperature is above it, you're going to certainly feel uneasy and not the best, right? That's exactly how inflation is. You have to have a certain threshold. You're used to a certain threshold. The manufacturer is used to, you are used to, the person who delivers, who employs you is used to. As an employee, I'm certainly used to a certain increment which will happen every year in my salary. So you're certainly used to a certain level of inflation. Now, this threshold level of inflation is a concept which has been discussed all across the world. Professor Dholakia of Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, has done a recent study. You're welcome to Google and read his speech and listen to him. It's fabulous. He was on the Monetary Policy Committee of the Reserve Bank for 3 years. He is now on the board of the Reserve Bank. So, a man who's really knowing the money market and the monetary system and the story of the money supply and inflation. He did his calculations, and then he says the threshold level of inflation in our country is 6%. If inflation is below 6%, you will feel uneasy. If inflation is above 6%, you will feel uneasy. Now, in things like inflation, you can certainly say, okay, I'll anchor my inflation at 6%, plus minus 1, so 7 and 5. So now you have a comfortable band. Or you can say 6, 8 and 4. You have a comfortable but a bigger band. But the issue is that if the entrepreneur, if the consumer, if the wage holder, if the wage receiver, everybody is used to a certain threshold, it is better to weave the economy around the threshold. At the end of the day, what do you aim at? You aim at the highest employment possible in your country. If you are able to drive employment, keep everybody engaged, you have achieved what you set out for. So therefore, keeping a threshold at 4%, imitating the West, and that West, which itself is very weak, and you have just realized how weak and fickle they are, and you have realized how they serve the interest of their own country and not yours. How much do you want to imitate them, and why? So therefore, I have been arguing for a long time, and Dholakia of course has come out with this recent study where he says the threshold level is 6, and please keep that in mind. Don't keep it too low. You will not grow the best. You will not create the best employment. Don't grow too high. Again, there is negative. So those are the dark zones. Your positive zone should be around 6, and that needs to be paid heed to. So we adopted inflation targeting in India, ignoring the thresholds which had been done and decided by economists within the country, and suddenly you have paratroopers coming in and they bring in the wisdom of the rest of the world. That's okay, nobody minds it. But then if you do not attune that to your domestic circumstances, you will end up in making your economy suffer. And that's where I think the inflation targets that were set in at very low levels, and that's why the economy has suffered. The multiple indicator approach, as I had just said earlier, is the best approach, balances both the sides, takes into account inflation, and I do not know how, but the rest of the world is thinking of multiple indicator approach, and maybe in India we should start thinking of a multiple indicator approach. Now here is the comparative picture, and herein I'm going to stop using my PowerPoint and I'm going to speak to you and talk to you about some of my thoughts. So what do you see in this graph? You see that the policy rates were pretty high earlier, right? If you look at January 18, and this, what I'm showing you, is before COVID. I'm still not showing you what was in the subprime or before in 2005. So the interest rates were high, and then they were brought down, and then as the Russia-Ukraine happened, the aggressiveness with which the rates have been raised, at the end, if you see, these are the advanced countries. RBI is also raising it because RBI is trying to hold on to as much capital as it can. So RBI is also trying to imitate, which I have been arguing you need not imitate. If the capital had to fly has already flown, and if it had to fly and the people who will take it and run are chasing money and they are not yours as it is, so why are you trying to hold them back? You take care of your economy. If you raise the interest rates very high, our economy will suffer, unemployment will set in, growth will be down. Don't do that. But then you know the Reserve Bank has more knowledge and wisdom and data than I have, and they are as patriotic as I am, so they in their wisdom do not match it 1-to-1. If America raises by 75 basis points, India tries to do it by 50 basis point and try to hold back whatever little they can of the capital. That's okay, that's their judgment. But my view is we need not imitate the West, and I don't mind if we had kept a pause button in the latest policy. Other countries are doing it. Japan is not raising, but you can say Japan is a different country. Russia is not raising, you can say Russia is still another country. Fine, but I have to take care of my local population and their growth. The Western countries all together, Bank of England, US Fed, Euro, are aggressively raising their interest rates. And they're ready for recession. They're ready for sacrifice. And they're ready because they can afford unemployment allowances. They have the wherewithal. Their population has the wherewithal. And they all know there's a recession coming in. And now I find it very strange and very funny and it is a ridiculing experience when the World Bank and the IMF say, we are going to enter a recession. Sir, you are not entering a recession. You are engineering a recession. Whom are you teaching? You are engineering a recession. And why are you doing, It's India who should do, because your steps are going to lead us into trouble. How are they going to lead us into trouble? Why, as an Indian, I am worried my export market is going to be impacted. It's obvious. And this recession is not going to last for 1 year. They are already anticipating it till the middle of 24. 2 years is a long time. They are entering into recession. Their growth rates will come down, some of them in the negative zones. My exports are going to suffer. What happens to my export industry and employment in my export industry? My people who are working there, many of them will be left unemployed. They may have to come back. Even if they don't come back, my remittances will suffer, which means income for me suffers. What happens to the education of our children? What happens to the children who have to go and study abroad and come back? They are going to suffer. So there are studies done on spillover. If something happens in these advanced countries, what happens to the emerging countries? And these spillovers are quite strong. Now, when you enter into a recessionary phase because you are ready, you are rich, you can afford it, and you impose the same recessionary trend on a weak country like India because we are vulnerable and we are poor, our people suffer. So obviously, in COVID, the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister did a great job. We did not have such high fiscal stimulus packages, but we did it wisely. We used our food grains, which were lying with the Food Corporation of India. And we said, we may not have the money to give you, but we assure you food at least. And we said, we have hospitals both in the public sector and the private sector. We may not be able to give you the best of medicines, but all the hospitals' doors are open for you. So we took care of the vaccine. We gave them free vaccines, whosoever wanted it. But the point is, a country like India, which is far more weaker and poor and vulnerable, can play such a cautious and such a studious role and such a responsible role and still come out. And you have seen the studies. Come out with what? You have seen the studies at both the IMF and the World Bank, which said that India has been able to handle the poor during COVID. And they did not slide back into the poverty ratios because the policies of the government were very strong and they held them there, which in the rest of the world didn't happen. Despite all the unemployment allowances that America could give, they have also had a slippage in poverty, and the rest of the world, which is not as strong, also had a slippage in poverty. So the point that I am making is that this aggressiveness of the interest rates that you are pursuing now, and the IMF and the World Bank were meeting today, and the next 5 days they are meeting in Washington, they should play a far more responsible role and say this aggressiveness in raising the interest rates and pushing and engineering a recession in these advanced countries, because of which the emerging countries are going to suffer, including India, should be mellowed. And once it is mellowed, you have a soft landing. And soft landing will make the emerging countries ready for it, make you ready for it. But then we have to, as a world, think together. We are totally integrated now. Your high temperature impacts me. and I provide you all the labor and resources and skills, and my best minds go and work there. And when you do a recession, the first ones to suffer are those, and they have to come back, or we suffer. And therefore, what is your global responsibility? Going back, somebody has to be held accountable that when the Lehman Brothers happened, on what pretext did you quadruple your balance sheets? Nobody to say caution. And then you give a Nobel Prize to a person in economics saying that he has handled it very well. What well? So I think the Western world has to think that if they have to take the lead and retain their polar position, they will have to play a far more global responsible role. And I would like to go beyond the Lehman Brothers and say, when the subprime started and those exotic terms of derivatives were used, why was there nobody to caution? And why does the Wall Street run the world? Where were those economists who later on said this is wrong or this should have been done differently when it was playing out in front of their eyes? Why were they not cautioned? When you roll out one vaccine, how many tests it has to go? First on the birds, then on the animals, then on others, and then on humans. But when economic policies are rolled out and they impact each one, somebody thinks of a fancy idea sitting on Wall Street making profits, and that gets replicated across the world with no responsibility later on, no accountability later on. So I think the Western world has to be held accountable and ask these questions. When the subprime was taking place, on what pretext were the derivatives introduced? When the Lehmans took place, on what pretext, defying the quantity equation, were the balance sheets expanded? And now, on what pretext are the interest rates being raised so aggressively? If Russia-Ukraine is the context, the war will be over soon. I've already mentioned to you the size of these two countries. How come these two countries can impact so much? And you would have read the latest about OPEC cutting down 2 million barrels of oil, and there is now havoc in the world. Why should it not be? If you are catering to the midterm elections in November in USA and you want the oil prices to be low to cater to that, why should the Saudis and the other OPEC countries not cater to their local clientage? I was interacting at the IMF in Washington when I was working there with some of the executive directors from these OPEC countries. And I was 45 years then. I did not know the meaning of sustainability. I had read in economics class sustainable growth, right? At that time even climate was not that big a thing. So I met these OPEC countries and they explained to me the concept of sustainable. They said the oil which we have under our soil is because of the past generations. And this oil which we have under the ground now belongs as much as to the future generations. If I exploit this oil to please somebody today and underprice it, I've cheated my future generations and I'm accountable to them. I never realized sustainability means that I owe something to my past generations and I owe much more to my future generations. If that is the concept of sustainability that OPEC countries enjoy, or the understanding that they have, what right have we to tell them, underprice your oil, because I have mid-November midterm elections in my country? Why? And how? What logic? So I think the Western world has to realize we have to coexist. And the planet is absolutely flat. Each one has its own rights and responsibilities. You cannot always claim because you're a rich country that all your rights are yours and we have none. If you want to be a global leader, you have to deliver on global responsibilities. If you can't, India is waiting to take over. We have done it for 3,000 years. We are ready to do it for next 10,000 years. Leave it to us. We will do a better job. Thank you.